Well, good evening. Welcome to the Campfire with Clay Steele. Now, this is where we sit around with friends and tell stories, enjoy each other's company, and maybe have a little something to drink along the way. Tonight, I want to tell you some more of this story from The Coyote by James Roberts. We're on chapter 12. I'll go ahead and tell you where this old outlaw is now. Against his ethics. Well, Rathburn's eyes held the others as completely as would have been the case if he were invested with a power to charm in some occult way. Moreover, every trace of his amiable, confiding smile was gone. His gaze was hard and cold and gleaming. His face was drawn into grim lines. When he spoke, he talked smoothly and rapidly, and with an edge to his words which convinced his listener that he was in deadly earnest. "I'm not used to jails, my friend, and I don't aim to stay here. You're not very far away, and these bars are wide enough for me to miss 'em, but I don't think I could miss you." The jailer looked in horror at the gleaming knife which Rathburn held by its hilt, with the blade pointing backwards. The jailer, he was from the border. He knew the awful possibilities of a quick motion of the wrist in that position. A half turn of the knife as it streaked towards its target. He shuddered again. "Now just edge this way about 2 steps so your holster will be against the bars," Rathburn instructed. "I can drop you where you stand, reach through the bars, and drag you close if need be, but I'm banking on you having some good sense." The jailer, without moving the hands which held the pencil and the pocket knife, sidled up against the bars. Now Rathburn, on his part, leaned forward, keeping his right hand high and tipped back, ready for the throw. He reached out with his left, just through the bars, and secured the jailer's gun. "Now it's all off," he said quietly. "If the sheriff or anybody else comes before I get out of here, I'm just naturally going to have to live up to the reputation for shooting that they've fastened on me. Now unlock that door." The jailer wet his lips with his tongue. His pencil and pocket knife fell to the floor. Now, covered by his own gun, now in Rathburn's hand, he moved to the door, brought out his key, and opened it up. Still keeping him covered, Rathburn backed to the bench, snatched up his coat, and walked out of the cage, motioning to the jailer to precede him into the office. Now there he slipped the gun in his holster and put on his coat. The jailer reckoned better than to try to leap upon him while he was thus engaged. The prisoner's speed with a 6-gun was well known. Now Rathburn drew a peculiar leather case from within his shirt. He put the knife in it and stowed it away in a pocket. Then he turned on the jailer. "Maybe you think that was a mean trick, resorting to a knife," he said pleasantly. "But all is fair in love and war, and when a man's in jail, you better sort of stand in one place while I look around a bit." He backed behind the desk in the big office, opened 2 or 3 drawers, and brought out a pair of handcuffs. He moved around in front of the jailer again. "Hold out your hands," he commanded. "That's it." He snapped the cuffs on with one hand while he kept the other on the butt of his gun. "You don't seem to have much to say," he commented. "Well, what's the use?" said the jailer. "I know when a man's got me dead to rights, but I'll be on your trail again, and if I ever get within shooting distance of you and you see you first, you'll never get a chance to pull a knife." "Well said," Rathburn admitted. "Well, now we understand each other. But I don't intend for you to ever get within shooting distance of me." Rathburn glanced casually about. "Now, it seems to me," he resumed, "that most of these fellers who gum up their jailbreaks make a mistake by hurrying. Suppose you just walk natural-like through that door and into the cage I had just the foresight to leave. That's right. Right on inside." He turned the key which the jailer had left in the lock. "Now you're all right unless you start hollering," said Rathburn. He stood quietly in the doorway between the office and the cages. The man's face from the desert studied him. He saw a variety of expressions flit over Rathburn's face: anger, determination, scorn, resolve. He was deliberately ignoring his opportunity to make his escape while conditions were propitious. He was waiting. Although the jailer felt the urge to cry out in an endeavor to make himself heard outside the jail and thus bring help, something in the bearing of the man standing in the doorway made him keenly curious to watch the drama which he knew must be enacted sooner or later before his eyes, for the coyote was certainly waiting for the sheriff. Rathburn now drew the jailer's gun from his own holster and toyed with it to get its feel and balance. He dropped it back into the holster, and in a wink of an eyelid it was back in his hand. The man from the desert gasped at the lightning rapidity of the draw. Time and time again that gun virtually leaped from the holster into the coyote's hand at his hip, ready to spit forth leaden death. The jailer drew a long breath. The man was accustoming himself to the weapon which had come into his possession, making sure of it, you see. Now he again stood motionless in the doorway, waiting. Boots stamped upon the steps outside, and Rathburn drew back from the doorway in the aisle before the cages. The front door opened, and a man entered. Both the man in the cage and the man in the aisle recognized the sheriff's steps as Neil closed the door, paused for a look about the office, and then walked towards the door leading to the jail proper. The jailer opened his mouth to sound a warning, but something in Rathburn's gaze and posture held him silent. Rathburn's body was tense. His gaze was glued to the doorway. His right hand with its slim brown tapered fingers hung just above the gun at his side. The sheriff loomed in the doorway. Without a flicker of surprise in his eyes, he took in the situation. His lids half closed as his lips tightened to a thin white line. He met Rathburn's gaze, and he knew that he now faced the coyote in the role which had won him his sinister reputation. "Did I mention to you that I wasn't used to jails, Sheriff?" said Rathburn evenly, his words carrying, crisp and clear. "I don't fancy 'em. But I needed the sleep and the meal, now I'm going. Do you recollect I said no one ever took my gun from me but what I got it back? I had to borrow this one from the gent in the cage. I'll take my gun, Sheriff, now." Neil had watched him closely. He saw that while he was speaking, the coyote did not for an instant relax his vigilance. The merest resemblance of a move would precipitate gunplay. He turned abruptly, and with Rathburn following him closely, went into the private room off the jail office. He pointed to the other's gun, which lay upon the flat desk where many had curiously inspected it. Rathburn took it in his left hand and ascertained at a glance that it wasn't loaded. Therefore, he elected to carry it in his left hand. "I won't take a chance on feeding it right now, Sheriff," he said. "Under the circumstances, it would be right awkward. If you make up your mind to draw, I'll have to depend on a strange gun." Sheriff Neal's eyes glittered, and his lips parted just a little. "Now, if you'll walk back towards the cage, Sheriff," Rathburn prompted. "Correct. Don't stumble." Neil backed slowly out of the door, through the second door into the aisle before the cages, watching Rathburn like a cat. Rathburn slipped his own weapon into his left hip pocket and with his left hand dug into the trousers pocket for the key to the cage. He didn't take his eyes from Neil's as he brought it out and inserted it in the lock. His right hand continued to hang above the gun he had taken from the jailer. "Sheriff," he said with a cold ring in his voice, "this may seem like an insult, but I'm going to ask you to unlock that cage and go on in. You can take your time if you want, but I warn you fair that if anyone should start coming up the steps outside, I'll try to smoke you up." For answer, Neil, with the glitter still in his eyes, stepped to the cage door, unlocked it, and swung it open. He took a step, whirled like a flash, and the deafening report of guns crashed and reverberated within the jail's walls. Neil staggered back within the cage, his gun clattering to the floor, his right hand dropping to his side. "If I hadn't been up against a strange gun, I wouldn't have hit your finger, Sheriff. I was shooting at your gun." He shut the cage door quickly, locked it. He stuck the key in his pocket. Then he threw the jailer's gun in through the bars and thrust his own weapon into its holster. "I want you gentlemen inside and armed," he said laughingly. "If the jailer will be so good as to read what's written on the paper on the bench, he'll learn something to his advantage. Sheriff, you and Brown were wrong in this, but the devil of it is, you'll never know why." He left Neil pondering his cryptic sally. He ran to the front door, opened it, and disappeared. Neil clutched his injured finger and swore freely, although there was amazement in his eyes. He could have been killed like a rat in a trap if the coyote had felt the whim. Now the man from the desert stepped to the bench and read on that sheet of paper. "If anybody ever gets to read this, they will know that what I said about learning to throw a knife is true. I can do it. I've carried that knife in a special case that would fit in my sock and boot for just such an emergency as come up tonight. But I never would have throwed it. It would be against my ethics." The man from the desert swore softly. Then he hurriedly picked up his gun and fired 5 shots to attract attention. Chapter 13, A Man and His Horse. When Rathburn closed the outer door after him, he plunged down the steps and into the shadows by the wall of the jail. Few lights showed in the town, for it was just past midnight. He could see yellow beams streaming from the windows of the resort up the street, however, as he hesitated. He was mightily handicapped because he had no horse. A horse, his own horse, he felt, was necessary for his escape, but his horse was a long distance away. So Rathburn stole across the street to the side on which the big resort was situated, and slipped behind a building just as the muffled reports come from within the jail. After a short interval, 5 more shots were heard, and Rathburn grinned as he realized that the jailer had fired the remaining bullets in his own and the sheriff's guns. He heard men running down the street, so he hurried up street behind the buildings until he reached the rear of the large resort, which was the place Lamy had held up. Peering through one of the rear windows, he saw the room was deserted except for the man behind the bar. And even at that distance, he could hear horses and men down the street. Doubtless they were crowding into the jail where the sheriff would insist upon being liberated at once. He could lead the chase, and as Rathburn had the key, this would result in a delay until another key could be found, or Brown, who probably had one, could be routed out. Rathburn thought of this as he looked through the window at the lonely bartender, who evidently could not decide whether to close up and see what it was all about or not. But the thing which impressed Rathburn most was the presence of a pile of sandwiches, several cans of corned beef and sardines, emergency quick lunches for patrons. It was on the back of the bar. Also, he saw several gunny sacks on a box in the rear of the place, almost under the window through which he was looking. Rathburn stepped to the door in sudden decision, threw it open, and walked inside. His gun flashed into his hand. "Quiet," was all he said to the stupefied bartender. He scooped up one of the sacks, darted behind the bar, brushed the sandwiches and most of the cans of corned beef and sardines into it, then slung it over his left shoulder with his left hand. "The sheriff will return the money that was taken from here," he said coolly as he walked briskly to the front door. "Play the game safe. Stay where you are," he cautioned the bartender as he vanished through the door. Now there were no horses at the hitching rail, but he saw several down the street in front of the jail. Men was running back and forth across the street after Brown, he surmised. Again he stole around to the rear of the resort, and then he struck straight up into the timbered slope above the town, climbing rapidly afoot with the distant peaks and ridges as his guide. Some 2 hours after dawn, he sat on the crest of a high ridge, watching a rider come up the winding trail from the east. He had seen other riders going in both directions from his concealment behind a screen of cedar bushes. He had watched them with no interest other than that exhibited by a whimsical smile. But he did not smile as he watched this rider. His eyes became keenly alert. His face was grim. His mind was made up. When the rider was nearing his ambush, Rathburn quickly scanned the empty stretch of trail to the west, then leaped down and confronted the horseman. Ed Lamy drew rein with an exclamation of surprise. "Well, there's not much time, and I don't hanker to be seen afoot," said Rathburn quickly. "Where's my horse?" "Well, he's in a pocket on a shale slope this side of the timber on a line from the house, where you left him," replied Lamy readily. "Or you can have mine." "Don't want him," said Rathburn curtly. "You going in to see the sheriff?" Lamy nodded. "His orders say, Coyote—" "He'll probably meet you on the way," Rathburn interrupted with a sneer. "You can be figuring out what to say to him. My saddle with the horse?" "It's a-hanging from a tree where you go into the pocket. Big limestone cliffs there below the shale. Say, Coyote, my sister and kid brother was telling me about your visit this morning, and I guess I understand—" "Well, we can't stand here a-talking," Rathburn broke in, pulling the tobacco sack from his shirt pocket. He extracted a folded piece of paper. "Here's a note I wrote you in jail before I left. Read it on the way in when there's no one watching you. Maybe you'll learn something from it, maybe you won't. I expect you wanted money to fix that ranch up, but you'll get further by doing a little irrigating from up that stream than by trying to be a bandit. You just naturally ain't cut out for the part." And with these words he handed Lamy the note and bounded back up the slope. The screen of cedar bushes closed behind him as Lamy pushed on, looking back, wondering and confused, with heightened color in his face. Well, it was late that night when Lamy returned to that little ranch house. Frankie had gone to bed, but his sister was waiting up for him with a meal and hot tea ready. He talked to his sister in a low voice while he ate, and when he had finished he read the note for the third time, read it aloud so his sister could hear. And this is what it said. "Lamy, I meant to take you back and give you up, for I was pretty sore, and then I saw your resemblance to your small brother by the freckles and eyes, and I remembered he had said something about you saying some decent things about me, so I guess you thought they were nice things anyway. Then I thought maybe you got your ideas about easy money from the stuff you'd heard about me. I sort of felt kind of responsible. I thought I'd teach you a lesson by flirting with that posse and telling you that killing story to show you what a man is up against in his game. I guess I can't get away from it 'cause they won't let me. But you don't have to start. I was going to give you a good talking to before I let you go, but I hadn't counted on that little kid in the house. I'm glad he told the truth. He'll remember that. I gave you back your gun because you hit the nail on the head when you said if I was square I'd give it to you and let you make a run for it. I took the money off and you, so if they got us, I could take the blame and let you off. Now I can take the blame without hurting my reputation, so don't worry. I'm not doing this so much for your sake as for your kid brother and your sister. I figured you'd sort of caught on when I heard they hadn't located my horse. That was a good turn. Do me another by getting some sense. There's plenty of us fellows that's quite capable to furnish the bad examples. Signed, Rathburn. The girl was crying softly with an arm about her brother's neck when he finished reading. What are you going to do, Eddie?" she sobbed. "Well, I'm going to irrigate," said Ed Lamy with a new note in his voice. "I'm going to build a sure enough ranch for us with this piece of paper for a cornerstone." Dawn was breaking over the mountains, stewing the gleaming peaks with warm rosetta color. A clear sky, as deep and as blue as any sea, arched its canopy above, Virgin stands of pine and fir marched up the steep slopes to fling their banners of green against the snow. Silver ribbons of streams laughed in the welcome sunlight. And in a rock-walled gulch, far above the head of Sunrise Canyon, a fire was burning, its thin smoke streamer riding on vagrant breeze. Nearby lay a dun-colored horse on its side, tied fast, and a man was squatting by the blaze. "I hate to have to do this, old hoss," the man crooned, "but we've got to change the pattern of that CC2 brand if we wants to stick together, and I reckon we want to stick." He thrust that running iron deeper into the glowing coals. Chapter 14, The Witness. The morning was hardly 2 hours old, and the crisp air was stinging sweet, the tang of pine and fir, as Rathburn rode jauntily down the trail on the eastern slope of the divide and drew rein on the crest of a high ridge. As he looked below, he whispered softly, "Juniper, hoss, there's folks down there plying a nefarious trade. A plumb dangerous trade," he mused, digging for the tobacco and brown papers in the pocket of his shirt. "I reckon they're carrying on in a direct defiance of the law, hoss." And the dun-colored mustang tossed its head impatiently. But his master ignored the animal's fretful desire to be off and dallied with tobacco and paper, fashioning a cigarette, lighting it, breathing thin smoke as his gray eyes squinted appraisingly at the scene below. Winding down into the foothills, in striking contrast to the dim trails higher up, was a well-used road. It evidently led from the saffron-tinted dump and gray buildings of a mine, which showed on the side of a big, bald mountain to the southward. At a point almost directly below the ridge where the man and horse stood, it crossed a small hogback and descended a steep slope between lines of jack pines, disappearing in the timber farther down. The gaze of the man on the ridge was concentrated on that bit of road which showed on the hogback and the slope beyond. A truck was laboriously climbing the ascent. But the watcher evidently was not so much concerned with the approach of the truck as with certain movements which were in progress on the hogback at the head of the grade. 3 persons had dismounted from their horses behind the screen of timber. One, a tall man, had donned a long black slicker and was tying a handkerchief about his face. "Juniper, hoss," said Rathburn, "what does that gent want that slicker on for? It ain't gonna rain. And how does he reckon to see unless maybe he's got holes cut in that there hanky?" A second man had made his way down the slope a short distance. He took advantage of the timber which screened him from sight of the driver of the oncoming truck. "I expect that's in case the truck driver should suddenly take it into his head to slide down backwards," said the observer, speaking his thoughts aloud in a musical bass voice. "One in front, one behind. How about the kid?" As if to answer to his question, the third member of the party, evidently a boy, led the horses a short way up the hogback where a good view could be obtained of the road in both directions. The watcher grunted in approval. One in front to do the stick-up, one behind to stop a retreat and get whatever it is they're after, and one on the lookout to see there ain't any unexpected guests. Couldn't have planned the lay any better ourselves, hoss. Now, he was too far distant to interfere, even if he had had desire to do so, which was doubtful from his interested and tolerant manner. Anyway, it could have done him no good to shout a warning, for the driver of the truck could not have heard anything above the roar of his machine, and the trio had gone about the preparations with dispatch. Already the truck was climbing the last steep pitch to the top of the hogback. The tall man in the black slicker and mask now quickly stepped forth from the edge of the timber. The watcher above saw his right hand and arm whip out level with his shoulder. There was a glint of morning sunlight and dull metal. The truck came to a jarring stop as the driver jammed on the brakes. Then the driver's hands went up into the air. Stepping from the timber at the roadside behind the truck, the second man leaped upon the machine. The watcher grunted again as he saw that this man was also masked. The driver was disarmed and searched, then forced to clamber down from the truck into the road, where the man in the slicker kept him covered, while the other quickly searched about the seat and the cab of the truck. Then the second man released the brakes and dropped nimbly from the machine, which plunged backwards down the steep slope, crashed into the tree growth on one side of the road, and overturned. The boy mounted and led the other two horses down the hogback in the scanty timber to the head of the grade. There the man in the slicker and his companion joined him, mounted, and the trio rode quickly along the hogback in a southerly direction and disappeared on a blind rail into the forest. Rathburn rolled himself another cigarette with a grin as he watched the truck driver stand for some moments uncertain in the road and then start rapidly down the slope toward his disabled machine. "Come on, hoss," said the erstwhile spectator, turning his dun-colored mount again into the trail. "So far as I can make out, this is the only way down out of these tall mountains to the east, so we might as well get going. We ain't got no business south or west. We'll be just in time to get blamed for what happened down here." Whatever there might be in the prospect, the rider did not permit it to have any influence on his cheerful mood. He drew in long breaths of the stimulating air and sniffed joyously at the fragrance of the murmuring forests which clothed the higher hills. Now far below, the timber would dwindle, the ridges would flatten out into round knolls and lose their verdure. Then would come the dust and the lava slopes, and beyond, the desert. A wistful light came into the horseman's eyes. "Home, Juniper, hoss," he said softly. "We've just got to have cactus and water holes and danged blistering heat in ours, and I don't care so much as the faded label off an empty tomato can as if it's California or Arizona or Nevada, so long as it's desert." The trail he was following wound tortuously around ridges through the timber into ravines and canyons, now treading close upon the bank of a swift-running mountain stream in a narrow valley, and again seeking the higher places where there were rocks and fallen trees and other obstructions. An observer would have gleaned at once that the rider was not familiar with the trail or the territory he had traversed. So it was past noon when he finally reached the hogback where the outstanding event of the morning had taken place. The rider looked back up towards the divide and grinned as he rested his horse just above the scene of the holdup. "Don't reckon they'd have heard me if I'd have hollered or seen me if I'd have waved," he mused. "They picked out a good spot for the dirty work," he concluded, looking about. Shortly afterward, as he was staring down at the tracks in the road, he smothered an exclamation. Then he dismounted, picked up two small objects from the dust at the point where the trio had started on their getaway. He examined them with a puzzled expression and thrust them into a pocket. "Really strange," he ruminated. "Mighty strange. If those silly things had been laying there in the road before the rumpus, they'd have been tracked into the dust. But they was on top of a perfectly good hoss track, and it don't look like there's been anybody along here since then." Well, he continued down the road, descending the steep slope, and came to the overturned truck. At a glance, he saw that it had been used for hauling supplies, doubtless to the mine he had glimpsed on the slope of the high mountain to the southward. Several kegs and nails, some hardware, some sacks of cement were scattered in the road. He remembered that the man who had climbed on the truck had only searched the driver and the cab. Anything he might have taken must have been in a small package, or it would have been discernible even at that long distance. Well, that outfit wasn't after no mine supplies, Rathburn reflected as he finished his brief inspection and he again mounted, and they wasn't taking any chances on smoking anybody up or being followed too closely. Pretty work all around, and here's the committee, hoss. A touring car came careening around a turn in the road and raced toward him. He turned his horse to the side of the road and spoke to him as the animal, plainly unfamiliar with motor cars, snorted and shied. The car drew to a stop with a screeching of brakes. The horseman raised his hands as he saw 2 rifles leveled at him from the rear seat. There were 5 men in the car besides the driver, and one of the men, who had been sitting in the front with the driver, leaped from the machine and strode toward the rider. "Calm your horse down and climb out of that saddle," he commanded. "And if you make any motions toward that gun you're packing, I'll make things simpler, in a way." Well, the rider slipped from the saddle with a broad grin. "Right up to form," he sang cheerfully, although he kept his hands elevated while the other took his gun. "My hoss'll be calm enough now that your dang thing is shut off. You must be a sheriff to be flirting with the speed limit that-a-way and forgetting you got a horn." "Where are you from and where are you going?" demanded the other. "Well, I'm from up in the mountains, and I never got where I was going if I hadn't seen you first the way you busted around that curve," was the cool reply. "Stranger," was the next comment in a tone of satisfaction. "Look here, friend, I'm Mannix, deputy from High Point. You'll sail smoother if you answer my questions straight." The deputy motioned to 2 men in the car. "Search him," he ordered. Then he stood back, 6-shooter in hand. The stranger built a cigarette while the men were going through him. He lighted the weed and smiled quizzically while they examined the meager contents of the slicker pack on the rear of his saddle. "See, you're packing a slicker," said Mannix, pointing to that rough, dark raincoat in which the pack was wrapped. "Yeah, that's in case of rain," was the steady answer. "What's your name?" asked the deputy with a frown. "Rathburn." "Where was you heading?" "Well, I was aiming in a general eastern direction," Rathburn replied in a drawl. "Is there any laws against riding hosses in this here part of the country?" "Not at all," replied the deputy heartily, "and there's no law against driving automobiles or trucks, but there's a law against stopping 'em with a gun." "So," said Rathburn, "you stopped 'cause you saw my gun, and I'm to blame for it? If I'd have known you were touchy about guns down here, I'd have worn mine in my shirt." One of the other men from the car joined the deputy. He was looking at Rathburn keenly. Mannix turned to him. "Look like him?" he asked. Man nodded. "About the same size and height." "Well, this man was driving a truck up here that was stopped this morning," said the deputy sternly to Rathburn. "He says you size up to one of the men that turned the trick, one of 'em that wore a black slicker, just like yours." Rathburn nodded pleasantly. "Exactly," he said with a smile. "I happen to be in the country, and I've got a black slicker. There you are. Everything's all proved up, and yet there was somebody once told me it took brains to be a sheriff." There was a glint in Rathburn's eyes as he uttered that last sentence. But instead of flying into a rage, Mannix laughed. "Don't kid yourself," he said grimly. "You're not the man who held up this truck driver." He gave Rathburn back his gun, to the latter's surprise. Then he waved towards Rathburn's horse. "Go ahead," he said, smiling. "General eastern direction, wasn't it? This road'll take you clean to the desert if you want to go that far. So long." He led the others back to the car, which started off with a roar. It passed the truck and continued on up the hill. Now Rathburn sat his horse and watched the automobile out of sight. His expression was one of deep perplexity. "By all the rules of the game, that fellow should have held me as a suspect," he soliloquized. "So now he don't know me from a hoss thief. Or does he?" He frowned and he rode thoughtfully down the road in the direction from which the automobile had come. Now, Chapter 15, The Welcome. The afternoon wore on as Rathburn followed the road at an easy jog. He quickened his pace somewhat when he passed through aisles in thick timber, and despite his careless attitude in the saddle, he kept a sharp lookout at all times. For Rathburn was carrying some gold and bills in a belt under his shirt, which had been examined and returned to him at the order of the deputy, and he had no intention of being waylaid. Moreover, The man's natural bearing was one of constant alertness. He rode for more than 2 hours without seeing anyone. Strange, he observed aloud. This road is used a lot, too. Maybe the morning ceremonies have scared all the travelers into the brush. But, as he turned the next bend in the road, he saw a small cabin in a little clearing off to the right. Spurred by a desire to obtain some much-needed information, he turned from the road into the clearing and rode up to the cabin. He doffed his broad-brimmed hat in haste as he saw a girl. Ma'am, I'm a stranger in these woods, and I'm a-looking for an honest man or woman to guide me on my way, he said with a flashing smile. Instead of returning his smile with a gracious word of greeting, the girl regarded him gravely out of glowing dark eyes. Pretty, he thought to himself. Limping lizards, but she's pretty. Where are you from? The girl asked soberly. Well, from yonder mountains, and then some, he answered with a sweeping gesture. You rode down this morning? I rode down this morning, down from the toppermost pop of the divide with the wind singing in my whiskers and the birds warbling in my ears, he laughed gaily. For he appreciated the puzzled look. I was wondering two things, he continued solemnly. What might they be? She asked doubtfully. First, why isn't there more travel on this good road? He said. I haven't seen a soul except yourself and, well, a party in an automobile. Now, on a road like this, where did you meet the automobile? She asked in a voice which he interpreted as eager. 2 hours and some minutes back and up, near a truck which had some trouble in the road. Perhaps you hear about it? Turned over on its side and collapsed after some free-thinking gents turned their smoke wagons toward it. It was plain that she was interested. Is the automobile still there? She inquired with a breathless catch in her voice. Oh, no. After some of the passengers had a little disrespectful conversation with me, it went on up the road. Are they scarce around here, ma'am? Automobiles? Not exactly, she replied with a frown. They truck ore and men and supplies to and from the mine every day. The reason you've seen so few people today is because it's Sunday. Thank you, he said gallantly. That answers my first question. You remember I was wondering two things. Her lips trembled with a smile, but her eyes flashed with suspicion. You will observe, ma'am, that I am not followed by any pack horses or heavily laden burros, he went on gravely, although his eyes sparkled with good humor. Nor is there anything much to speak of in this slicker pack back here on my saddle. I need some new smoking tobacco, some new shaving soap, some new haircut, a bath, a dinner, and a bed, after I put up my hoss. This time the girl laughed, and Rathburn was rewarded by the flashing gleam of 2 rows of pearls and eyes merry with mirth. But her reciprocating mood of cheerfulness was quickly spent. You are only 1.5 miles from High Point, she said hurriedly. You can get what you want there. She retreated into the doorway, and Rathburn saw that the chance interview was at an end. Gracias, as they say in the desert country, he said, saluting as he turned away. It means thanks, ma'am. He looked back as he touched the mustang with his steel and saw her looking after him with a strange look in her eyes. That gal looks half like she was scared, hoss, he reflected. I wonder now if she got me wrong. Dang it, maybe she thought I was trying to flirt with her. Well, maybe I was. He thrust a hand in a pocket and fingered the 2 objects he had picked up in the road at the scene of the holdup. Then he pulled his hat a bit forward over his eyes and increased his pace. The town, as he had half expected, came suddenly into sight around a sharp bend in the road. High Point consisted of some 20 structures, and only a cursory glance was needed to ascertain that it was the source of supplies and rendezvous for entertainment of the several mines and all the miners and prospectors in the neighboring hills. Several fairly good roads and many trails led into it, and from it there was a main road of travel to the railroad on the edge of the desert to the east. Before he entered the dusty single street lined with small buildings, flaunting false fronts, Rathburn recognized the signs of a foothill town where the hand of authority rested but lightly. He rode directly to the first hotel, the only two-story structure in town, and around to the rear where he put up his horse and left his saddle, chaps and slicker pack in the care of the barn man. He received instructions as to the location of the best barber shop, speedily wended his way there. He found Sunday was not observed in the barber shop business, nor in the resort which adjoined it. "Is there any chance to get a bath here?" he asked one of the two barbers with a twinkle in his gray eyes. He expected a snort of astonishment and a sarcastic reply. "Sure, you want it first or you want it after?" Rathburn eyed that barber suspiciously. Was that man poking fun at him? Well, he was not a stranger to repartee. "First or after what?" he asked, scowling. "Your shaving haircut." Rathburn laughed. "Well, I'll take it first if you have it. And if you have, I'll say this is a first-class barber shop." The barber led the way to a room in the rear of the place with a pleased grin. Now, an hour or so later, Rathburn, and with the lower part of his face a shade paler than the upper half, his dark hair showing neatly under his broad-brimmed hat, and his black riding boots glistening, and a satisfied smile on his face, sauntered out of the barber shop into the resort next door. A man was lighting the hanging lamps, and Rathburn looked about through a haze of tobacco smoke at a cluster of crowded gaming tables, a short bar, a cigar counter, and the motley throng which jammed the small room. He grinned as he read the sign over the cash register. "Free drinks tomorrow." Swiped in broad daylight from the grand old state of Texas, he murmured aloud to himself. Then he noticed a small restaurant in the rear of the place, separated from the main room by a partition, the upper part of it which was glass. He made his way back, passed through the door, and took a seat at the counter which afforded him a view of the resort through the glass. He ordered a substantial meal, and while waiting for it to be served up, studied, with calculating eyes, the scene in the next room. The men were mostly of the hills, miners constituting the majority. Of professional gamblers there were many, and there was also a plentiful sprinkling of that despicable species known as boosters, whose business it is to sit in at the games in the interest of the house, to fleece the victims who occupy the few remaining seats. But now he saw a man who apparently was not a miner or a prospector, nor yet a member of the professional gambling tribe. This was a tall man, very dark, sinewy. He wore a gun. At first Rathburn thought he might be a cowpuncher, for he wore riding boots and had something of the air and bearing of a cowman. But he finally decided that this classification was inaccurate. An officer at one of the mines, perhaps, or forest ranger. No, he didn't wear the regalia of a ranger. Rathburn gave it up as his dinner was put before him on the counter. He fell to his meal eagerly, for he had had nothing to eat since early morning, when he'd broken camp high in the mountains to the west. Steak and French fries began quickly to disappear, along with many slices of bread and 2 cups of steaming coffee. Then Rathburn looked up, and to his surprise, saw the tall, dark man was standing near the glass, studying him intently out of a scowling black eyes. Rathburn looked at him coolly and steadily for a few moments, and resumed his meal. But the other was inquisitive, and Rathburn sensed, without again looking up, that he was being watched. Was this man, then, an aide of Mannix, the deputy? He doubted it. He finished his meal, paid his score with an added cheery word for the counter-jumper, rose and entered the main room of the resort, and walked directly up to the dark man who was still observing him. "Was you thinking I was an old acquaintance of yours?" he asked pleasantly. The other's eyes narrowed, and Rathburn thought he detected a glow of recognition and satisfaction. "Did you have a bath?" sneeringly inquired the man. Rathburn's brows lifted, and then he smiled strangely. "Why, I sure did. Why? Did I maybe keep you waiting? Was you next?" The other's eyes blazed with wrath. "Let me give you a tip, my friend. You ain't right well acquainted in this here locality, are you? Rathburn now noted that they had attracted immediate attention. The tall, dark man, then, was a personage of importance. He noted another thing, too. Rather, he realized it by instinct as well as by certain mannerisms. The man before him knew how to use that weapon which hung low on his right thigh. If you mean was I born here or do I live here, I'd say no, Rathburn drawled. But I happen to be here at this precise time, so I'd say I'm right well acquainted with it. A hush had come over the place. Interested faces were turned in their direction, and Rathburn sensed an ominous tremor of keen expectancy. The fine wrinkles at the corner of his eyes tightened just a bit. This is a poor time for strangers to be hanging around, said the dark man in a loud voice. The Dixie Queen payroll has been taking wings too often. The implication in the murmur from the spectators was not lost upon Rathburn. His lips tightened into a fine white line. Whoever you are, you've got more mouth than brains, he said crisply in a voice which carried over the room. The effect of his words were electric. There was a sharp intaking of breath from the spectators. The dark man's face froze, and his eyes darted red. His right hand seemed to hang on the instant for the swoop to his gun. Rathburn appeared to be smiling queerly out of his eyes. Then came a sharp interruption. Just a minute, Carlyle. Rathburn recognized the voice of Mannix, and a moment later the deputy stepped between them. What's the idea? He asked coolly. Why, this gentleman you just called Carlyle seems to have appointed himself a reception committee and welcoming me into the enterprise in town, a high point, drawled Rathburn with a laugh. Mannix turned on Carlyle with a scowl, and Carlyle shrugged impatiently, his eyes still glaring balefully at Rathburn. The deputy again confronted Rathburn. Had your supper? He asked. God, best steak I had in 2 months, Rathburn replied cheerfully. And the horse taken care of? First thing. There was a note of derision in Rathburn's voice. Service at this hotel barn is high grade. Mannix's eyes hardened before he spoke again, and he hesitated. But when his words came, they were clear-cut and stern. Then come with me, and I'll show you where to sleep. You mean in jail? Queried Rathburn. Mannix nodded coldly. Sheriff, said Rathburn in a peculiar tone, addressing the deputy but looking over his shoulder directly into Carlyle's eyes. If there's one thing I'm noted for, it's for being a good guesser. Well, there you go. This cowboy gets himself in more trouble than anyone else I know. Well, we'll hear some more of this story next time we get together here around the campfire with Clay Steele. Good night. Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the B-itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some B-itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.